All right, Raiders, I am going to read aloud an article in order to introduce to you the Progressive Era. Keep in mind that the Progressive Era occurs after the Gilded Age. Think to yourself about the word progressive. You might notice a word within that word, progress. Think about the meaning of the word progress before we move forward with the article. The title of the article says The Square Deal, Theodore Roosevelt and the Themes of Progressive Reform. Progressivism arrived at a moment of crisis for the United States. As the 19th century came to a close, just decades after the Civil War, many feared the nation faced another explosive and violent conflict, this time between the forces of industrial capitalism and workers. Hint, think about the Gilded Age. Armed conflict between workers and the government broke out repeatedly. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 triggered armed confrontation. The 1892 strike at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead, Pennsylvania steel plant included a bloody battle. And just 2 years later, the strike at Pullman Palace Car Company brought Army troops into a violent clash with workers on the streets of Chicago on the 4th of July. To increasing numbers of Americans, something seemed dreadfully wrong. These economic and social crises stemmed from the rise of industrial capitalism, which had transformed America between the Civil War and 1900. By the turn of the century, American factories produced 1/3 of the world's goods. Several factors made this achievement possible: unprecedented scale in manufacturing, technological innovation, a transportation revolution, railroads, an ever greater efficiency in production, and the development of new consumer products. Standard Oil, Nabisco, Kodak, General Electric, and Quaker Oats were among those companies and products to become familiar household words. Many negative consequences accompanied this change. Cities, polluted and overcrowded, became breeding grounds for diseases like typhoid and cholera. A new unskilled industrial laboring class, including a large pool of child labor, faced low wages, chronic unemployment, and on the job hazards. Business owners didn't mark high voltage wires, locked fire doors, and allowed toxic fumes to be emitted in factories. It was cheaper for factories to let workers be injured or die than to improve safety. So they allowed poor working conditions. Many were appalled. Even middle class Americans became outraged as the gap widened between the working and middle ranks of society, and wealthy capitalists became greedier. A new class of muckraking journalists fed this outrage by writing books about business exploitation and corruption of government officials. Progressivism grew out of that dismay and a desire to fix what many saw as a broken system. Progressivism emerged in many different locations from 1890 to 1917 and had varied goals. Sometimes it focused on social justice emphasis with a focus on economic and social inequality. At other times, an economic and political emphasis dominated, with primary interest in moderate regulation to curtail the excesses of Gilded Age capitalists and politicians. Overall, the main goal was to fix problems that were happening across the United States. These progressive reformers came from diverse backgrounds, often working together in temporary alliances or even at cross purposes. Most progressives shared the belief that it was a government responsibility to address social problems and regulate the economy. Among progressivism's greatest champions was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had a genius for publicity, using the presidency as a bully pulpit to bring progressivism to the national stage. Although Roosevelt was known as a trust buster, his ultimate goal was not the destruction of big business, but its regulation. For Roosevelt, the concentration of industry in ever fewer hands represented not just a threat to fair markets, but also to democracy, as wealthy industrialists consolidated power in their own hands. He turned to the Sherman Antitrust Act to challenge business monopolies, bringing suit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad trust, in 1902. During Roosevelt's second term, regulating business became increasingly important. Roosevelt had always believed big business was an inevitable economic development. Regulation was a means to level the playing field and provide the square deal to citizens, as Roosevelt had promised in his reelection campaign. Roosevelt's square deal included three main points. First, conservation of natural resources. Second, consumer protection, which means making sure people did not get ripped off by companies selling items to them. And third, control of corporations. Do not let companies or factories take advantage of their workers. Although not always successful in achieving his goals, Roosevelt brought to the federal government other progressive causes during his presidency, including support for workers' rights to organize, 8-hour workdays for federal employees, workers' compensation, and an income and inheritance tax on wealthy Americans. Under his leadership, conservation of the nation's natural resources became a government mandate. He encouraged Congress to create several new national parks, set aside 16 national monuments, and establish more than 50 wildlife preserves and refuges. Through the new Bureau of Fisheries and National Forest Service, Roosevelt emphasized efficient government management of resources without waste. The government would help Americans get healthy, safe food, safer workplaces, decent housing, and fair business practices, among many other things. Theodore Roosevelt epitomized progressive rebuke of the outrageous excesses of capitalists and their cronies, but also typified progressive accommodation of the new order. Yet he never believed we could turn away from the new economy and the transformation it had wrought in American society. The balancing act of reform and regulation that Roosevelt and other progressives pursued led the nation through the moment of crisis at the end of the 19th century and accommodated it to the modern industrial society of the 20th century. William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson would follow Theodore Roosevelt as the next two progressive presidents. However, their role in the progressive movement was far less than Roosevelt's. Throughout this time, the progressive era would also focus on women and African Americans.